Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ACIT podcast. And I'm here with Marvin Däumichen. Welcome on the podcast, Marvin.
Hi, Manuel. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
It's a pleasure. So I'm just going to give a short introduction of who you are, what your background is, and then we can start talking about our common interests and common passions. You graduated with a Master of Arts in American Studies at the Humboldt University in Berlin a couple of years ago. And you wrote your thesis on postmodernism, identity theory, and psychedelics in the 60s. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit as well, if you're interested. And you're now writing a dissertation, so you have a Ph.D., around the sociological implications of cannabis discourse on digital media. And on the other hand, probably the thing we're going to focus on this conversation is that you are Director of Research and Knowledge Transfer for the Mind Foundation, which is the foundation focused on advancing the study of psychedelic substances across Europe. So this connects to the previous podcast we had with Moad Abdelhai, where we already also talked about psychedelics. And there was a lot of interest by our listeners in this topic. So I think it's nice to continue this conversation with you and cover a lot of the ground we hadn't had yet time to cover.
Very well.
So maybe we can just start with your dissertation and your PhD project, and then I think there's a couple of ways we can nicely transition into the more general questions around the Mind Foundation. So maybe can you give a short summary how you ended up in your dissertation project and what you are looking at, roughly speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. It's actually an educational research study as well as media research, media studies, in which I'm looking at social media discourse on cannabis content by influencers, and what impact that can have on socialization of young people. Right. It actually ended up from something else. My main interest had been more of a theoretical approach towards what is this new democratized, basically anything goes, uncontrolled digital space, these experiential spaces that the social web produces, what do they actually mean for discourse on drugs and for drug education? With many people in my network, including mine, coming from a harm reduction, prevention, and substance research background, the question is, is it actually conducive to public health, or is it maybe a threat to public health? What does it mean overall? Asking critically, what does it do to approaches, discourse, narratives surrounding substances and substance use, which are illegalized in most of the world, on YouTube and the likes, right? And I think it is about cannabis now, which I think in a way was a strategic decision, because cannabis, also with my supervisor, has been more of a hot topic lately, as being re-regulated as medicine and so on and so forth. But this question of what does social media, public discourse do, I think is more fascinating when it comes to substances like psychedelics, for example, that are less common, that are less discussed on the schoolyard, in families, in prevention activities, right? We have in epidemiological studies, we see that the people who use psychedelics are the least probable to develop problems with them, especially addiction and the likes. And also psychedelic substances in absolute numbers are used least frequently. So at the same time, these ominous substances are discussed on YouTube, for example. There are plenty of channels in which people give advice on how to dose, what is the right setting, and so on and so forth. But are they experts? Most of the cases, they are users. And they usually make a disclaimer at the beginning of the video saying, hey, I'm not an expert, don't do this at home, this is just my experience, and so on and so forth. But obviously, studies have shown, and we all know that, especially for young people, peer groups and the influence of their peers might greatly outweigh any other sort of influence that they're confronted with in their daily life. So having these people who you can count as influencers, talking about their experiences, saying they've had such a great time on LSD, for example, it is definitely having an impact on young people and their drug use prevalences. but are they qualified, and so on and so forth. So I think this is where my interest came from. And now I'm looking at cannabis in German-speaking social media. I had planned to look at Instagram and YouTube, those being the most popular ones. I mean, TikTok has seen a surge recently. It's also, as a platform, it's been topic of debate. So that might still change because, indeed, a significant deal of my time, both professionally and in private, are dedicated and have been dedicated to the work of the Mind Foundation.
So I think one of the issues that surround this kind of vacuum of information that comes about through the criminalization of these substances, that really you necessarily move people towards these kind of subspaces on the internet. It's kind of similar what's happening with the right, for example, in the US, that is being banned from Twitter and social media networks, and then they move to stuff like Parler, for example, where they really have this information vacuum where people just talk to each other, basically, and there's really no influence by state actors, for example, to influence the discourse and kind of from the state level achieve some kind of education. And you also mentioned that there's this kind of difference in reach between like the education campaigns, for example, by the German government versus what private videos achieve. So can you address this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is called the social web for a reason, right? People are looking for peers, they're looking for other content and people that are relatable. And when a 14-year-old student who has smoked cannabis, for example, once and had a great time with their friends, goes to YouTube, Googles cannabis education, finds this public from any sort of public institution and video, it's usually a cautionary tale, right? They're going to tell them, hey, this could happen, this could go wrong. How is this relatable? And then if they're looking at another channel by a peer or anybody a couple of years older who might even show some status symbols, a nice watch or whatever, anything, some sort of cultural relation in the subculture, maybe they like the same music, play the same music in the video, this is relatable. And it's interactive because you have these comment sections, and suddenly you create some sort of encounter space, right? In which even the producers of the videos tend to ask, so what is your experience? How has it been for you? And a social environment is created. And this is relatable. You can identify, you can connect, and all these things is what people desire, right? We're social beings. So of course, this is much more engaging. And it's also more relatable in the sense that it's consistent with the experience of the user. So if the kid had a good experience, had fun, I'm sure there are risks. It didn't go wrong in their case. It's great. And so if somebody else talks about their positive experiences, that's relatable too. And then at the end of the day, this could potentially lead to a mistrust and even further, a general mistrust towards what the government is telling you. And we see in a lot of young people in subcultures, whatever it is, hip hop, reggae, and so on and so forth, that are related to cannabis, is that there's this element of distinction, of being different from the mainstream, of smoking the herb of the oppressed, right? Of being different, of being rebellious in a way. So all these narratives are part of these subcultures concerning cannabis, and also, of course, other substances. So you're creating social spaces, creating social networks, which are not really having an access or seeing themselves as part of the narratives and the education that official government outlets, for example, provide.
Yeah, I still remember from my own experience during school when like the police came to school and started educating young people, I think age 12, 13 maybe. I don't know what the kind of the target audience for these kind of interventions in the schools are. But it was, I remember still distinctly that during this age already, in kind of the group of friends, everyone was really critical of the information they got, because we already then had access to these alternative information spaces. I think stuff like Land der Träume and these kind of forums that were talking about drugs in a completely different way and offered kind of some like alternative insights into how these substances function and how they operate. So can you maybe summarize? Do you think in some way this prevention strategy by the state has failed, or what kind of new strategies are they developing and trying to cope with this social media environment now?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's an old hat that sending police officers to caution kids against the dangers of taking drugs is not very successful. And there is literature on this, and there's research on this, and it is evident, and it should be evident to everyone in the field by now that um, people who are experienced, who've had their own experience, positive or negative, with such drugs are a better source for information because they are relatable, right? And a lot of schools and a lot of prevention activists, they actually consider this and they develop good programs. So, for example, Finder Research, which is also somewhat related to Mind, has been related even more, is doing great work. They're a prevention, harm reduction, education research organization in Germany, and I think it's worthwhile looking into them and their programs. They do train teachers, but they provide a whole plethora of programs and educational resources. So what's important is really that you consider the relatability of what is said. It's always about the connection between the experiential world, the everyday life of somebody who you want to address, and a systematic approach to something, right? If the government makes a cut to our to taxes that affects every product in the supermarket and makes it 3 cents cheaper, for the whole federation of Germany, this is a great number of savings for the people, but for each individual, it doesn't really help anything. So it has to be something that is relatable on a personal level to the individual, and that is happening. So I'm optimistic.
And maybe to move to a more humanistic perspective on this whole discourse around educating young people with respect to using drugs. You mentioned that you also look at it from the perspective of developing personal responsibility, of this Mündigkeit in German, this kind of perspective of what rights does the individual have with respect to drugs. So
yeah, I mean, in a way, drugs alter consciousness, right? Psychoactive drugs alter your perspective, your perception, therefore possibly your self-perspective. They might change patterns of behavior. All this, of course, with regards to the medical discourse around psychedelics is very important. And in general, on a humanistic level, it should be, and many have said so, everybody's right to determine and decide for their own what sort of states of consciousness are worthwhile to engage in, whether you use substances or not. So it's, of course, an emancipatory call to say that people should have the right to make their own decisions. At the same time, Mündigkeit, so the competence, the autonomy to decide on your own, is not just a claim or something desirable per se. It's something that involves a lot of educational efforts, the building of competences. It's really a life to create it. Such competence, such autonomy really beckons for a lifelong developmental challenge that has to be renegotiated. And frankly, when it comes to the use of substances, a competent user, an autonomous person who makes decisions whether they want to use it or not, is likely to rather not engage in substance use than to engage.
Yeah, maybe we can use this opportunity to segue now to the Mind Foundation, because you told me previously that there was originally also a drug prevention background really at the core of what the Mind Foundation stood for. And I think, yeah, it really fits in nicely with this idea of education and of developing this personal responsibility and creating competent users, and by that means to actually serve as efficient drug prevention and to reduce harm and these kind of things. So can you maybe explain a little bit with what purpose in mind the Mind Foundation came into being and what kind of values they represent?
Sure, happily. The Mind Foundation is structurally emerged from Finder. So that's a prevention harm reduction research organization. And structurally, for the first 1 or 2 years, we were actually an initiative that you could consider a project or a pillar of Finder. And the people behind Finder, especially Henrik Jungaberle, Maximilian von Heyden, also Andrea Jungaberle, they have medical backgrounds. They are substance and prevention researchers. And so these were also the guiding lights, right? When we started the Mind Foundation, we had in the intention to, of course, demonstrate to the public, to influence public discourse, to stay within that register, to highlight the possibilities, the potentials, but of course not neglect the risks and the challenges in the use of psychedelics in medical application as well as in personal development. So once again, creating a competent, autonomous individual that is really competent to make the informed decisions on actually health-positive, health-beneficial use of such substances. That was one of our goals. And over the years, of course, we've had many different projects, many different directions, because also our group was very eclectic. We started Mind with 26 volunteers, right? Who have changed with a huge rotation over the years, who had different interests. And so some wanted to implement psychedelic substances into psychotherapy. Others were users that wanted to have their rights changed, to have it possible to create safe and legal spaces in personal development. And of course, there were religious people. And for Mind to really create a clear profile, that in itself took maybe a year or so, because in an illegalized field, and especially within the psychedelic field, which I think is more fragmented in users' attitudes than anywhere, possibly, it's very difficult to find the people that you're looking for. And what we were looking for is clearly science-interested individuals who are not primarily users, but really want to have a positive impact on society at large.
So have the current, like the values of the Mind Foundation shifted by developing this profile? Is it now less about drug prevention but more about the scientific perspective of psychedelic research?
In a way, yes, but not entirely. So I think first of all, I have to point out. Hope it wasn't too unclear previously. When I'm talking about drug prevention, it doesn't mean preventing drug use, right? It means preventing harm from drug use, which can happen if you use less drugs, but it can also happen when you use drugs in an educated and competent way. So prevention is very closely related to harm reduction in that sense. Projects within the Mind Foundation that we started early on with regards to prevention of harm. Some of them that were dropped simply because it is not feasible for an organization that ran almost entirely based on the hard work of many volunteers for 3 years, right? Only 2020 has been the first year in which we were really able to hire people. So we had to narrow down our activities. Of course, we're still very sympathetic towards other organizations that focus on harm reduction. I think this is very important. But what we have personally focused on, simply first and foremost, for matter of our resources and capacities available, is high quality science, right? Such as the Psilocybin depression study that we're running together with the ZT Mannheim and the Charité in Berlin, as well as educational projects and trainings for professionals.
So there's two things here. You mentioned so maybe we can move towards the current projects, like the biggest project the Mind Foundation is currently pursuing. On the one hand, you mentioned the study at ZI in Mannheim, which we can talk about in more detail. And then the other one is this augmented psychotherapy training, which really aims at offering this kind of environment for therapists to learn to offer therapies with psychedelic substances. So maybe we can start with a study at ZI in Mannheim.
Yeah, sure. So this study is a collaborative, a joint study, if you will, by the Central Institute for Mental Health in Mannheim. The principal investigator is Professor Gerhard Gründer, and a team from the Charité University Medicine here in Berlin, as well as the Mind Foundation and our partner, our clinical partner, Ovid Health Systems, who also provide researchers from the scientists group and support the study financially. So Professor Gründer and the team, they are setting out, and they have been planning to do so for 2 years. It was a long process to get this permitted. They're setting out to treat 144 patients that have been diagnosed with treatment-resistant depression. The study has 2 branches, 2 centers, one at the ZI Mannheim, the other one here at the Charité in Berlin. And the therapists and researchers group will give them psilocybin, the active compound, in the psychedelic mushrooms. The psilocybin has been synthesized and will be shipped here from Wisconsin, from our partners, our friends at Usona Institute. And we're expecting the first bit of results, some qualitative results possibly, by the end of the year. And for the overall study to conclude, it will take several years, of course. But we're hoping for a very good response. And the goal of the study is to demonstrate the efficacy and the safety of psilocybin as an adjunct in psychotherapy in the treatment of hard-to-treat depression.
Maybe to put this into perspective, this is not the first study with psychedelics for treatment-resistant depression. So there have been previous studies. Can you contextualize this a little bit?
Absolutely, there have been previous studies already in the 1950s into the 1960s. There has been a great deal of interest in psychedelic substances in psychotherapeutic practice, and there was already evidence, for example, also with regards to substance use disorder, and starting in the early 2000s. Over in the United States, especially a little bit in Switzerland, there have been studies that have been able to demonstrate the relative safety and efficacy of psilocybin as an adjunct to depression treatment. Our study is actually the largest genuinely German study of its kind, and the first one, almost the first one since about the 1970s. Compass Pathways, which are UK-based, have a very similar study that's international, with a small branch here in Germany as well. They will be treating 15 patients here in Germany.
Maybe to understand how meaningful this is for the psychedelic research community, can you list some of the challenges that you were facing with getting this study funded and maybe accepted by the public, and what it actually means now that the study is possible, from a political perspective?
Yeah, well, it has been permitted entirely in November 2020. 17th of November was in a way a breakthrough date, because there has been a huge heap of preparation leading up to this permission, right? And until then, even though the team and we had been in a way optimistic, this is still a breakthrough, because this simply was unthinkable for many decades. It's a clinical study with people who suffer from a mental disorder that we want to treat with an illegal substance, right? This is what it is on the papers and in the German laws. So, of course, one of the great hurdles is even getting a permission. And getting a permission from an ethics commission. If you want to give people drugs, this has to be ethically intact, and that has to be demonstrated. So the team spent so much time, 2 years, preparing grants, preparing applications to make this happen. And we, I think, had the first great feedback in May. I have to say last year now, since it's January 2021, and in May 2020 we had the first breakthrough, you could say, in which the German Federal Institute for Research and Education gave us a recommendation for the study to be supported by public funds, which is quite likely to happen now, but not entirely confirmed. And that would already be a breakthrough, that the government says, hey, what you're showing us with the potentials of your study and with the body of evidence that is already out there, that you could also demonstrate in your applications, convinced us that this is worthwhile financing and that there might actually be potential, and we should allocate some public money to that. Secondly, the BfArM, which is sort of the equivalent to the FDA, German Federal Ministry of Medical Products and Medical Devices, gave us their permission in November, which also was a breakthrough because this simply hadn't happened in such a long time. Yeah, and then the Ethics Commission followed, and now we have cleared all hurdles. It is a breakthrough because it simply hadn't been permitted previously.
And maybe what's also important to mention in this context is this idea of scheduling drugs with respect to their potential medical uses. And as psilocybin had been a Schedule 1 drug, so it was officially declared that there was no medical use. And I think it's still a Schedule 1 drug. I don't know if you know what's happening there in the US right now, and what your estimate is if this scheduling might change in the near future.
It will. And if you'd asked me 4 years ago, I'd been much less optimistic. But in the meantime, I think 2018, the FDA over in the United States declared MDMA and psilocybin as breakthrough treatments, and people are, of course, looking into petitions to reschedule them. The Schedule 1 means no medical value, very high potential for addiction, which is simply not true here. And it has been demonstrated, and we are making a significant contribution to the evidence in there. Right, treating 144 patients is a significant number. It's a large study. And for example, partners over in Australia, in which they have it's called the poison schedules or something similar, which is equivalent to our BTMG or the Scheduled Substances Act. There it is at the schedule level 9, which is equivalent, is the worst. And there has been a petition lately in which they wanted to get rescheduled to just at least one level lower so it can be used in medical environments. So worldwide, if you look very far to the east, in the cultural west, though, in Australia, as well as over in the United States, things are moving forward, and we're having our study approved. It's set to start in the next couple of months. I'm very optimistic that there will be a rescheduling. And it is not our goal to have these substances available recreational anytime soon, right? It's important that we demonstrate where it can really help people first and foremost.
Yeah, it's a kind of a similar development that also happened with cannabis, that you really start out with this medicalization, but this medicalization and then it's kind of beginning of the commercialization of drugs, if they could be shown to be safe and then move into the public eye and be used more recreationally. That brings a couple of risks and like potential backlashes, but also a lot of potential with it. Previous to this podcast, you mentioned that in the way Germany, kind of the reception of cannabis in Germany developed, you could see some of these risks and backlashes. So what do you think of could happen here with psychedelics? Or
yeah, very true. There are risks, right? As much as we have potentials in the use of psychedelics, there are risks. Same goes for cannabis. If you look at meta studies, still the efficacy and safety of cannabis are not always confirmed, right? There's quite a lack. If you look at reviews, there's quite a lack of consistent results. And I'm more optimistic to find these with psychedelics, but let's be cautious. At the same time, of course, as much as these things are mainstreamed, as much as they might be re-regulated, rescheduled, there are a lot of actors in the fields, and many actors have many different motivations and intentions, and some are purely capitalistic, right? What I find fascinating are, for example, labs like in the UC Davis over in California, where they were recently able to create a derivative from ibogaine that is not neurotoxic, which is not psychoactive, and significantly reduced craving in rodents. So there was a great adjunct to that's based on a psychedelic, but is not psychedelic, and a great adjunct to substance use disorder. At the same time, with the green rush, coming back to that, the green rush in cannabis, re-regulation, a lot of businesses coming in, people going to the stock market. there was an explosion, and of course, it will also be an implosion at some time and sort of a reduction. And that's what we're seeing here in Germany. With psychedelics, it's going to be the same. We have a lot of businesses going and companies going into the stock market now, looking into different ways of marketing it. There are companies who are marketing a nootropic psilocybin microdose nose spray, right? So cognitive enhancer, this is happening. And these things need to be regulated. They need to be controlled in a way, because we simply cannot have a Wild West, anything goes environment. And Europe is not a place where this is likely to pass any legal boundaries anyway.
Yeah, and with this shift of focus with these investors and businesses and stock market actors coming in, kind of moving the shift away from like really thinking still about efficacy and thinking about the implications of these substances. So this definitely brings certain risks with it.
Of course, ethics, right? It's all ethics, and for anyone who knows the psychedelic community, which once again is very fragmented, and you have people from all different walks of lives who have their very different opinions about what psychedelics are, what they call psychedelics, right? Entheogens, hallucinogens, and so on. And who actually has ownership of them, and what are they supposed to be used for? So there will be cultural battles and cultural arguments about this. And what's most important is that you have the well-being of people in mind, whether they use it in self-development or as a medical adjunct. It's about an ethical framework that needs to be at the bottom or at the groundwork of what you're doing. And that's something that we cannot guarantee for all the actors in the market, of course.
I don't know if you know like any precise numbers, but to my mind, psychedelics aren't as widely spread as cannabis. So it's like 1 or 2% maybe of the population that have any experiences. So I was wondering if there's even enough interest in these substances, or if they don't only attract like a small subpopulation that would really have a comparable boom with companies.
Yeah, of course. Here in Germany, lifetime prevalence of cannabis use is over 20%, and well over actually. And it depends what population you're looking at. Especially young adults between 18 and 35 are very likely to use cannabis. However, for psychedelics, it's somewhere between 2 and 3% in most populations. So, of course, this is marginal. At the same time, when there's more public talk about something, when it becomes more visible, interest might increase. And when the discourse changes from soft drugs to hard drugs and so on and so forth, things are quite likely to change. And people are definitely moving in echo chambers and so-called filter bubbles in the World Wide Web, the internet, which is our main source of information these days. So once you develop an interest into these things and you start Googling it, the search engines will show you more of such results, and you will get into communities where these things become very, very much embraced. So that, of course, beckons for care for those who are in these communities to not overstate the overall prevalence and popularity. Of course, psychedelics are not mainstream, and they should not be, I think. And it's very clear that they are not for everyone. At the same time, I think in the next couple of years, especially when they become implemented into our health system, we need to change the public discourse about what they are and what are their risks, because more people will catch wind of psychedelics.
Yeah, in Silicon Valley, there was this interesting trend of like this general hype about around microdosing, which kind of fit into not the self-exploratory idea, but more the self-optimization perspective on increasing creativity, increasing productivity, making people feel better, kind of fitting into that whole new like rebranding of these substances, not as really something psychedelic and mind expanding, but more something, like drinking an extended cup of coffee in the morning.
Absolutely, yeah. And once again, this comes back to ownership. Some people will claim that this is not what you're supposed to use psychedelics for. But who do they belong to? LSD doesn't belong to Albert Hoffman. And what is right and what is wrong? How should you use it? All these are questions that cannot be answered at this point because they have a strong ethical component.
maybe to in terms of this creating these ethical spaces in which psychedelics are taken responsibly, we can talk a little bit about this augmented psychotherapy training that you, as the Mind Foundation, are offering now, kind of what the aims are and what the approach is.
Sure. Yeah. So I think when you need to stress the importance of a responsible dealing with psychedelics, that is more for in the case of sort of using it for self-exploration, for self-development, which I think is quite possible, right? Given the right framework, things that setting, drug, and whatnot. But the augmented psychotherapy training is really a medical context still. This is something we announced, I think, just 1 or 2 weeks ago. So it's brand new, and we are open for registrations at the moment for therapists who would like to undergo a comprehensive training program that will finally educate them to or train them to be psychedelic therapists in the sense of using such substances. And let's not forget, this is revolutionary, right? Using a substance as an adjunct in psychotherapeutic treatments is quite different from how we have used psychotherapy up to now, because it was only speaking. And now you have this factor X, this chemical that you give somebody, and the person will have their experience that is hopefully reflective to really help them break out of dysfunctional patterns, for example. That will create a totally different environment for treatments. And so in this program, we're building up on the premise of integration as the first year, right? Integration training, which is also something very important when it comes to psychedelic experiences, that you learn to integrate them into your life, and integrating in the sense of, in a healthy way, bringing an experience you've had into your whole, into your being, rather than disconnecting from it or fragmentizing yourself. And year 2 and 3 will be more geared towards psychedelic experiences and what is their value, what is their cultural load, and what is their potential therapy. So for now, we can, of course, not offer any experiential sessions for soon-to-be therapists using psilocybin or the like. But in the near future, presumably we're going to have psilocybin rescheduled, we might be able to actually have trainees undergo such experiences. But of course, there are also two different camps, right? And I think that's also a fascinating topic for discussion, that some researchers and therapists would argue, no, if the therapist has had psychedelic experiences, it makes them biased as a scientist. It disqualifies them from their objective perspective on the research field. On the other camp, they would say, no, they have to have had these experiences so that they can relate to their patients, so that they can understand what's happening inside them. And so our approach is to go the safe route and potentially in the future also offer such experiences as part of the training.
Yeah, a thing we also mentioned in the previous podcast was that a lot of people that take part in these studies for treatment of depression, for example, really report this psychedelic experiences being among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their life. So, I mean, I think this illustrates pretty clearly that becoming a psychedelic therapist and really taking part and really participating in these tremendously meaningful experiences with the patients is a big challenge. So it's necessary to be educated properly. And I think there's like lots to learn.
Quite likely. And a little anecdote: we have a psychedelic experience survey running at the moment on our website. So anybody listening to this who would like to report on their personal experience that was meaningful using psychedelics, please do so. And it's fascinating. You know, we have already a significant number of responses, among which there is a significant lack of negative responses. So it seems people who are reporting about their psychedelic experiences tend to report about positive experiences. So is there a lack of negative experiences? Maybe. I think it's interesting what it means and what are the results for people when they take these things and when they report about them. At the same time, a negative experience can also be very fruitful, but that's a different discussion, I guess.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned was also interesting, because there's this kind of study done with like they were trying to find out how public perception of people researching psychedelics changes by them having already taken them. And it was shown that people generally think that that decreases the credibility of the researchers if they already had experiences with these substances themselves. I don't know if you know that study.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. I think when talking to our scientific advisory board, when talking to people from the outside, right? When I talk to my aunt, we're telling them we're not users, right? Whether I ever have had a psychedelic experience myself or not is not part of my work, and being a user or not being a user is not a part of the identity and the profile of mind. So to some people, we're telling them we might be the most boring organization in the field, because we are not about psychedelic use or psychedelic experiences per se. We're about the research and the potentials of psychedelics, even in their non-psychoactive way, and possibly especially with derivatives, for example, that are not psychoactive. So in that sense, that reading that study was a very gratifying experience to myself, because yes, there seems to be a strong bias towards researchers that openly admit they are users or have had experiences, and it reduces their credibility. So mind is not about the use of psychedelics, it's about the good work around them. I think it's a fascinating study, and it's fun, and it's really affirming to our profile.
Yeah, I think mind is really pushing in the right direction with separating these two issues completely. Do you think that this could potentially also, with just in the media being reported about these studies being affirmed and this rescheduling of the drugs taking place, that people just start to realize that this huge stigma that surrounded psychedelics kind of helps perpetuate that idea that researchers would be biased that have taken psychedelics, and then it becomes something just more natural and people kind of manage to contextualize it better, and then it's not going to be a big issue anymore. Do you think this will change?
Of course, potentially, yes. But at the end of the day, who has the time? You know, if these things, if mental disorder, if substance misuse, if whatever it is, if the Hare Krishna religious cults play no role in your everyday life, you're not that likely, or a lot of people are not that likely to really go in depth with them. So changing the public discourse is a long campaign, and the public view on drugs has been strategically twisted for decades. In the beginning, it was definitely a strategic political move, which also had its own rights in a way, right? At the end of the upheavals of the 60s and the great tumults, an American government that saw themselves being threatened by all these revolutionary drug users, it was a way that they could regain power and legitimacy in seeing a threatened establishment. So this conservative backlash, I'm not saying it was justified or right, but it's more like a logical consequence. And nowadays, when we have a systemic change towards a re-regulation of psychedelics after these years of misinformation in the war on drugs, things are going to change. But of course, not everyone's going to change their mind. And not everybody needs to change their mind. But those who are seeking for efficient treatments should have access to them. Those who have had psychedelic experiences need to be able to make sense of them, to integrate them. And those who are seeking information and are seeking such experiences need high quality, unbiased information. And if they're determined on doing it, they are going to do it anyway. They need controlled substances in the sense of regulated substances that have quality assessments rather than drugs from the streets, right? It's not going to change. Users will be users. That's what the war on drugs has shown. And so to those people to who this is important, I think we can make a change and the public perception will change. And to those who it doesn't matter to, it will not matter to them.
Yeah. What do you think actually caused this kind of psychedelic renaissance, this change of, at least in some parts of the like political landscape, also this change around perception of psychedelics and this increase in research again after this like long period of repression? And do you think there could be backlashes that really bring psychedelics back to this kind of dark age of a complete stop on all kinds of research?
So are you talking about the Psychedelic Ice Age?
Yeah.
I think there are many factors. Of course, it's, or not of course, but it has been the global West in a sense, that is, especially America being the pioneer in the 60s in the culture, which led to its great downfall. But also people like Rick Doblin and MAPS, right? That was founded in 1986. They did such hard work, and he reviewed the study subjects from Walter Pahnke, who did the psilocybin and Good Friday study in 1963. And they were making an impact on public discourse, of course, and they were supporting such research. And people like Roland Griffiths, who got permissions to give psilocybin in palliative care, right, to end of life anxiety patients. Those were significant steps, and also Switzerland, with Peter Gasser having this compassionate use exception in 1997, I think, and there are a few smaller steps that come together as a larger puzzle that changed the research environment and therefore also the permissions that we're getting. And as much as it has moved underground, the war on drugs didn't change the psychedelic community much, right? It was just less visible, and there were still psychedelic therapists, and there were still incidents. So the culture has still developed. We have a huge international festival movement of people using psychedelics. The Grateful Dead were this band that basically created this whole touring and all these deadheads. That's really a cultural development that has spread and that has continued to develop. Whether those substances were illegal or not, it's not going to suffice as a repression to prohibit something. Now, as things are getting better in that sense, that we can do research again, that we can look towards a possible re-regulation, all the demonization and the scare tactics have always been based on inflating individual incidents and scandalizing them, right? Headlines in the newspapers: young lady took acid, gave birth to a frog, and this is your brain on acid. If you take LSD, you think you're going to think you're a duck, jump out of the window. Individual stories of people that went wrong are very, very powerful, because it's also relatable. If it's a normal newspaper, a daily, and you print that, hey, 2% of people in Germany take LSD in their lifetime, and hardly anyone reports any problems with it, it's not very powerful. It's going to be powerful if you report one kid that takes it and that, runs around the village in Brandenburg with a knife, right? Overflowing with blood. This happened, and this is very, very factual in the media. So now that we are moving forward towards a more positive and beneficial environment in research and application, we have to be cautious that individual actors don't mess it up for everybody, whether they are planning to or not. And that's why it's so important to have a strong moral, ethical framework in your work. And when you're an actor, player in the field, you cannot just give psilocybin microdosing to everybody. Somebody's going to overdose, and then somebody else might just, go wrong with it, and that might really cast a bad light on everyone.
Yeah.
So be cautious still, of course, and that counts for every player in the field.
Yeah, especially because these psychedelic shock stories have a certain kind of poignancy. There's really some really crazy stories that you can tell easily. that achieve this effect. Is it
Absolutely.
Is it still? Do you think also from a state level? I'm maybe connecting also back to your dissertation, like what the current tactics around education around psychedelics is in schools still, if that still happens in the same way as it did 10 years ago, or do you also perceive a shift in the way like the state deals with it, or is it kind of still this schizophrenic, like this on the one level funding these studies while on the other hand continuing with this kind of misinformation?
Yeah, well, you have to consider that our study would be the first one to be state funded, right? So it's not like the government has changed its agenda and accepted and started supporting psychedelic research, and of course that is also one of the biggest challenges in the field. We have a lot of other clinicians come up to us since Mind is quite known now, and hoping that we could fund their studies. It's not easy, of course. With regards to drug education, I think psychedelics are simply not the greatest interest in prevention measures because there's such a low prevalence of people using these drugs. And of course, discourse has changed. I think it should be evident now that there's no such thing as a gateway drug, and this is not being taught in programs anymore. But much is still to change. I can't really say that governmental prevention efforts have transformed dramatically. No.
So maybe as an outlook to like what the next 10 years could possibly bring, you already mentioned that like this rescheduling of the psychedelics is very likely going to take place. But do you think this will, like everything will take off in the next 10 years and we will be in a completely new place in 2030? Like, what's your prognosis?
A completely new place of good access to high quality information, of regulated substances, possibly something like a driver's license for drug use, right? That's also kind of an old hat that people have been talking about, Lorenz Berlinger. That all would be desirable. Having an educated and competent public, that adhere to the standards, that adhere to what is actually reasonable, is also something that we have seen to really fail or not to occur in the pandemic that is going on now. So I think there will be backlashes. As much as it's looking good now and we're optimistic and can be hopeful, I think we're also facing a lot of challenges coming up. Some of them might be predictable, others might be entirely unpredictable. And with a psychedelic economy growing globally, competition is something that we are witnessing to start now, right? It's not just the competition between people trying to have a good time and taking drugs and who has a right to it, but it's also to those who are providing it in the legal as well as in the illegal markets. So it's most important that we stay cautious and that we hope we can continue with good work that educates the public and that is an aid to therapy and medical use of psychedelics. I think, yes, in 10 years we can most likely, 5 to 10 years, I'll be a bit more hopeful. We can expect psilocybin here in Europe as a legal adjunct to psychotherapy. And after that, I think we should maybe have another interview and see where we go from there on.
Yeah. You mentioned yesterday that, like, surprisingly, talking about unexpected things, the COVID pandemic was actually beneficial for Mind.
Yeah, yeah, that's another comparison or another connection I should be cautious with, right? So the pandemic is showing that civil disobedience can be quite rampant, and I think that's critical. It has also shown that isolation is something that should be taken seriously. And we are expecting an increase in mental disorders, right? People getting depressed, substance use disorder, and whatnot. And I think these are tendencies that have been visible to some individuals early on during this last year. And yeah, for Mind, it was successful in that sense that we have had a significant donation given to us, that we were able to start and rent our own office, to hire people. I worked for Mind basically every day, not full time, but I spent the last 4 years building Mind with my colleagues without any financial compensation. And as you know, we all have to get by somehow. And so this year we were able, thanks to this, to the benevolence of a few individuals, to really start over in professionalizing ourselves and not becoming dependent on investors who are economists or any other players that are trying to get something out of Mind. So the pandemic was, let's put this in parentheses or in quotation marks, good for Mind, in that people can see the work we're doing is really important and it's worthwhile supporting, because we're trying to alleviate some of those problems that isolation and depression might bring.
For people that have listened this far, they are obviously interested in the topic, so maybe we can also talk a little bit about the Mind membership and kind of what framework you offer when it comes to becoming a member.
Sure. The Mind Foundation is registered under German law as a non-profit. It's charitable, gemeinnützig, it means. And we offer memberships via our Mind Members Association. Point of being a member is that you can join a network of people who have similar interests. And that ranges from anybody interested in the psychedelic experience and the meaningful application of psychedelics, via students to medical professionals, and anybody else, therapists, or, for example, lawyers, clinicians, researchers, and the likes. The benefit of this is not just the network, but that you are able to that you're able to get more information from us more easily. We have newsletters that you can subscribe to anyway, but there are lots of contents that we produce, and members have a discount. I think, in a sense, if you are part of the psychedelic field and you would like to see it consolidate to become more accepted and more structured and also safer for users or for whoever, making a contribution to this field is basically possible through a membership, right? This is not a promotional podcast, I know, and it shouldn't be. But I can tell, if you want to make a change to the field, it's best that you support those who actively work in it. And of course, the return is not just a long haul, but a lot of our contents. We have the Mind Academy with public talks, with workshops, the Exploratorium with experiential sessions, non-pharmacological methods of altering your state of consciousness, as well as Unimind, for example, as a journal club group, which is entirely free, right? As a non-profit, we're not looking to make profit, but we're looking to empower people to learn more about themselves, psychedelics, and their mind.
Yeah, so what is Unimind? Can you explain that quickly?
Yeah, sure. And since you had Muad on your podcast recently, I think he made a great start in demonstrating who he is and how he thinks, because he's a real scientist, right? I'm somewhere between science and you call it. So Unimind is something that Muad inspired me to start. In, I think, September 2018, he told me that at the University of Heidelberg, he has this journal group in which they regularly meet to read and discuss science publications on psychedelic science. And I thought, hey, wow, this actually sounds great. Why don't we turn this into a network, right? Because connecting people is also something that is one of our values, creating community and connectedness. And so with the help of a couple of my colleagues here, and also with Muad, we built a whole, for lack of better word, franchise, you could call it, though it's entirely free to be part of Unimind, a whole system, a whole ecosystem in which journal clubs can grow and flourish at universities discussing psychedelic studies, because coming back to my own studies, it was very, very difficult to convince my professors and my supervisors that, hey, even in the cultural studies, you need to look at psychedelics and the implications of psychedelics on societies that we have had and that we're seeing to continue to grow and to develop, even in art, and maybe especially in art. Psychedelics are such a diverse field. There's so many ways of looking at them, and there is scientific literature. And so for students, oftentimes they find themselves quite isolated, whether they have taken those substances or not. They might have an interest in them. They might have very different angles of looking at them, very different disciplines. And I think UniMind is a great space to come together and to really interdisciplinarily discuss these publications that you can find. And last but not least, of course, to build this community. And now UniMind is covering, I think, about 22 locations, a lot of them in Germany, most in Europe. We have one in Brisbane, Australia. Yay. Good guys. They're very active, in which they regularly get together. It's mostly students. Some of them hire staff or faculty. And it's a social space and, of course, an academic space. And it's not for hedonistic purposes, but it's about intellectual exchange and academic networking. So I'm very happy to see UniMind flourish, and it's really growing, and it's giving students a voice to also voice their own interests and to address the supervisors, the professors, and tell them, hey, look, this is what we have. This is so if you're an undergrad student and you have this interest, you probably wouldn't even know that there's so much literature about your interest.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I think UniMind is a great initiative. So I know it's not officially a promotional podcast, but considering you guys are a nonprofit and you're really putting your heart's work into this, I think it's something well worth advertising for.
Thanks.
So as the Mind Foundation, you're also organizing this yearly conference, the Insight Conference. So can you give some background information on what's happening there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. So the Insight Conference is actually biannual. So that means it happens every second year, with Insight being on the odd years. So the first one was in 2019. Next one is going to take place in September 2021 here in Berlin. And it is our conference for researchers, for doctors, for therapists, and for anybody else, students and the likes, who are interested in psychedelic research and psychedelic applications. It is a 3-day conference. The last one had 650 people on site. It was fully booked. It was an amazing event with a bunch of pre-conference workshops, social events in the evenings, and so on. And the next one will once again also take place in September next year or this year, and is covering a whole bunch of tracks. So this time, since the market of psychedelics and the economy is growing, we're also inviting the industry. So besides clinical research, basic research, medical application, self-development, philosophical, anthropological questions, there will also be a track for the psychedelic industry. And the other sort of conference that we're doing is the Symposium Bewusstseinskultur. But actually, before I go there, sorry, the next conference of Insight, since we have the pandemic now and it's not entirely supposed to end anytime soon, will be online, fully streamed, as well as on site. So we're hoping to be able to invite all of our guests to Berlin here, but we're also definitely planning to have an unlimited amount of tickets available for the conference to be streamed online. Now, in the even years, 2020, 2022, and so on, we have the Symposium Bewusstseinskultur, which is a 1-day event that will likely always take place at the Mind offices, because we also have a larger event space. And this is more of a philosophical, ethical an environment for philosophical and ethical questions concerning implementation of psychedelics. The concept of Bewusstseinskultur, as in the culture of consciousness, and their assessments, is the place at which we're going to discuss this. So the Insight and Symposium Bewusstseinskultur are both great events. I can only recommend anybody to take a look at them. We have great speakers, and it's always fun. And of course, some of the magic really happens between the talks, right? When you meet people on the corridors, on the halls, and you get into conversations and you build a network, and students find mentors, clinicians find maybe donors for their studies and sponsors and whatnot. So it's quite magic.
Maybe to also take this opportunity to take a step back and because you mentioned that you essentially worked for 3 to 4 years for the Mind Foundation without getting any compensation, financial or otherwise. So maybe what drives you to put so much time and effort into the Mind Foundation? And
yeah, I mean, of course, everybody has some sort of a personal story, whether they're a user or not, right? I've grown up in a rather unusual social environment in which also Eastern religion has played a big role in my family, and the study of consciousness, and having my parents take me over to India several times when I was much younger, and seeing Goa, experiencing these dropout communities trying to look for meaning, and I was trying to look for meaning in their communities, and what's the basis for this, right? And by and by, I discovered that the psychedelic culture is really a thing, and that it's diverse, and that it has been around, and I try to understand. So that's how I developed this interest. And studying the humanities and cultural studies, I noticed that it's very difficult to be vocal about your interests. And once again, whether you're a user or not, right? I was not. But still, talking about it even makes it look bad. At least you might think so. So that was something that created a great idealism in me, that open discourse is something very important, that you're able to speak about things without being judged too much, and without people jumping to conclusions. So I think it coincided nicely that I moved forward into my master program. At the same time, we founded Mind, and there was great idealism in a lot of us that really wanted to change something in the public and in the world and in the medical application. And once again, coming back to social media and online drug discourse, it creates a great sense of belonging, and belonging is something everybody is looking for. And you belonging in a group, as well as what you are interested in, belonging in society as a topic. And so Mind, I think, was for a lot of us was a potential to really create this shift in perspective, and I think it's happening now. And that gave me a lot of strength and persistence, tenacity, if you will, to continue with that work, because I felt like what we're doing really belonged where it is. And now we're beginning to really reap the first results, and it's a great time to work even harder now to make it last and to really change something. Of course, it's interesting that among those, it was actually 26 people who founded Mind who were there on that day, right? Within the first couple of months, a few dropped out because actually they were not serious. One person we kind of had to drop right away because after a couple of days, turns out this guy's a drug dealer. Okay, not welcome, sorry. and then again, over another several months, people came, people left. It's very hard to sustain such idealism and to commit your free time and energy to work that doesn't seem to pay off right away. So it was a long haul and a lot of experience for all of us. And I'm very thankful for those who have stayed with us. And I'm also very thankful to everyone who was there at a time or another.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a beautiful, maybe ending statement if we want to wrap it up at this point. But yeah, thanks a lot for joining me on this podcast and for the amazing work you're doing with the Mind Foundation. And I really hope you guys continue the way you've been doing so far and push this forward.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. And looking forward, maybe in 4 or 5 years, when the promised re-regulation of psilocybin has happened, you can interview me again. I'm going to tell you what will be the next step.
Yeah, awesome. Looking forward to that.